Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Since this show will air on the last day of 2019, I thought it appropriate to review some highlights from previous Wider View episodes. These episodes can all be found in our show archive at widerviewradio.podbean.com. We began 2019 with an interview with Catherine Shackdam, who is now head of the Yemen unit for the Next Century Foundation in the UK. She gave us her insights into the character of Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince who subsequently ordered the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Here's Catherine.
Well, the first thing, when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, he's really the product, of the Saudi regime, in that he's the privileged prince that, reacts rather than think. He doesn't understand. He's been surrounded by people who do his bidding all the time. He's been praised for anything and everything. So he's not used to be criticized or even challenged in his worldview. And so, he has become, I think, like the epitome of what Saudi Arabia is in terms of its system of governance. It's a violent reactionary theocracy, and that's what he is. So he refuses anything and anyone that is not like him, who does not agree with him. He is a wannabe king that is very much the embodiment of tribal and Bedouin law, in that he believes that he has right of life and death over his people, and whoever he feels falls under, his authority. And so that works for Yemen, and that explains the why of the violence and the, systematic, bombing and aggression against civilians. He wants people to bow down to his will. So as far as the MBS is concerned, I think he's everything that all princes are, maybe to a greater extent. So he's maybe just a little bit more than the others, but he's really like the others. I don't think he's more stupid or more violent or more bloodthirsty than his cousins and nephews and uncles and brothers and sisters and whatnot, because they're all part of the same system. They've all been raised under the same value and ideas that they can do whatever, whenever, with whomever.
In that same program, Catherine reflected on the role of the United States in the Middle East and made her predictions for the year.
For a while, I think the U.S. missed the boat when it comes to its influence in the Middle East, and I think the whole Asian bloc in general. And I think that the U.S. will continue to suffer defeats, both diplomatically and militarily in the region, because it's not. There is a lack of trust, and no one takes the U.S. seriously now with Donald Trump in the White House, because he's very erratic and very emotional. He always reacts; he doesn't think. In that, he's very similar to Mohammed bin Salman, by the way.
Yes.
But so I think that America will continue to be more isolated and kind of out of touch. And I think what we're seeing is the death of an empire. So America is going to have to either reinvent itself, which I don't think so, because it would require a lot of political courage. Or basically kind of withdraw within its borders and kind of, go quiet a little bit. I do think that we're going to see a lot more coming from Russia, China, and Iran when it comes to that region. And that could be a good thing with Turkey. So it's too early to tell, but let's see. But I don't think it's going to be worse, to be quite honest with you, because nobody wants war in their backyard. So if anything, they're going to try to promote a bit more maybe financial cooperation, commerce, these kind of things, which is good for the region. People need to get out of poverty if we want to get rid of instability.
Well, she's pretty accurate, don't you think? The focus of Wider View is U.S. foreign policy. And in speaking with former CIA Station Chief Phil Giraldi in April, I asked about our foreign policy and who it actually benefits.
The problem in the United States is that our system has been so corrupted. It's corrupt at every level, in every branch of the government. And there are a whole lot of constituencies that are served by doing X, Y, Z. And like, for example, as you know, I'm sure, when legislation is passed in Congress, there's always a whole lot of riders that go along with it that serve special interests. And this is no different in foreign policy. If somebody has a constituent who gives him a lot of money and he has an interest in Singapore, something will show up in the trade bill without a title, without anything, that will benefit that individual in his business. So the foreign policy has been distorted by the corruption in our government. And why I wrote what I did was I just kind of went through my mind and said, well, where is it that you could say something is really being done that's good in foreign policy, and even if you lump in trade policy, you might suggest that coming to grips with certain dysfunctions in the Chinese trade with the United States makes sense. And there are maybe a few other areas where you would find something that makes sense. But as far as I'm concerned, NATO has outlived its usefulness. As far as I'm concerned, the Israeli relationship is abuse of the United States. Saudi relationship, you could say the same thing for. Many countries in Latin America are now wary of United States policy, particularly as it's evolving in Venezuela. This is going back to gunboat diplomacy sort of thing. So I don't see an area, even Canada or Mexico, where, particularly not Mexico, where we are doing things that benefit. Purpose of government is to benefit the governed. At least that's the way the founders tried to arrange it, and the ancient Greeks looked at it the same way. But I don't see where we've any more on that page where we expect our government to do things that will actually benefit us. We just kind of figure it's going to be painful, and we just have to kind of sit down and bear it.
Well, do we have to just sit down and bear it? Well, the theory is that we have a democracy here, and that we, every 4 years, get a chance to choose a president who is then going to run our foreign policy, and hopefully can, if he or she so desires, change it into a different direction. But that doesn't seem to be happening. And one of the reasons is the lack of a true opposition party. I spoke in March with political scientist Benjamin Studebaker about the Democratic candidates for the presidency and the prospects for systemic change here in the United States.
Over the last 40 years or so, the Republican Party has mainly been on offense against the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has tended to set the table, construct the narrative, and is pushing the country in the direction it wants to go in. And the Democratic Party has mainly played defense and attempted to, in some places, slow or inhibit that progression. But it hasn't really taken control of the discourse by promoting an alternative narrative that might resonate with voters. This kind of triangulation, this accommodating of Reaganism, I think was a response to electoral defeats in the 80s, Mondale's, and then Dukakis's, culminating in Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats who came up during the Clinton era or in the era following Bill Clinton's presidency, they made a number of accommodating moves to conservatism in their economic policy, in their approach to the prison system, in their foreign policy. And these accommodations have turned the Democratic Party into a kind of soft version of the 80s Republican Party. And there are a lot of international problems where I think the Republican Party's position is fundamentally untenable and can't resolve anything. And so if you have a Democratic Party which is committed to cooperating with that position or accommodating that position, instead of challenging that position and attempting to shift the narrative, then I don't think that we're going to be able to resolve those problems. And so I think there's a type of Democrat who goes, I'm charismatic, I'm a nice person, I can talk across the aisle, or look, I have all these compelling policy white papers, surely someone's going to care about that. And they don't understand that the Republican Party is fundamentally uninterested in our substantive objectives and goals. It has completely opposing and contrary substantive objectives and goals. And we have to force it to change by pushing an alternative narrative that is not a version of or a softer version of the Republican narrative. To give an example, in say, the case of Beto O'Rourke, he was in the bottom 25% for liberalism, according to most metrics. When he was a representative, he voted conservative the bulk of the time. He's got more in common with Joe Manchin than Bernie Sanders. And then you look at someone like Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren's whole approach has always been about the deserving middle class and the position of the deserving middle class. And she's conceded a lot of ground on poor people, welfare recipients. Her policy is never really focused on them. And she's someone who was a Republican until 1996, and so agreed with much of what the Reagan administration did, and even as late as 1992 considered the Democratic Party to be too anti-market for her. I have a lot of concerns about these people. I have a lot of concerns that their fundamental approach to politics is to accommodate the parts of the Democratic Party that are hawkish, the parts of the Democratic Party that are very pro-finance, and also the same for the Republican Party.
Well, I think we would have all agree that Benjamin is on target there with that analysis. Later in that same broadcast, Ben shared his principles for selecting a candidate for president, and I think they're just as valuable now as they were back in March when he first shared them to the wider view audience.
You posted an article recently entitled How to Evaluate a U.S. Presidential Candidate, which I think has a lot of bearing on the ideas you were just talking about. Maybe you could outline those. I think you had 4 questions that had to be answered.
So the 4 were, what's the candidate's history? What does this candidate actually do with power when they have it? So this was about looking at, if someone has got a record in politics, what have they done when they've been in office? Have they tended to make deals with, take money from, accommodate centrist and right-wing forces? Or have they instead confronted those forces? And if they try to confront them, do they have some history of defeating them in some way? So, for instance, Bernie Sanders came up in Vermont as an independent candidate and beat the Democratic and Republican parties in that state and managed to drag that state considerably to the left over a period of several decades. So he's got a history of challenging centrist forces rather than accommodating them, and of being successful in those challenges. Whereas you look at someone like O'Rourke, who's got a voting record where 40% of the time he's voting with Republicans, there's no comparable history of doing that.
Right.
My second stipulation is, who is given the candidate money? Who does this candidate rely on to run their campaign? Who can they not afford to alienate? So if you're someone who can't raise a lot of money from the grassroots, then the only way that you're going to be able to fund a competitive campaign is to turn to the big money donors. So if we see someone who's producing low grassroots figures, that person is either going to lose, or at some point they're going to have to turn to the traditional sources of Democratic fundraising to make their campaign competitive, and that's going to drag the campaign to the right. So someone like Elizabeth Warren, who isn't raising enough money from the grassroots, can only be a competitive candidate in the long run if at some point she starts taking corporate money. Mm-hmm. Third, what is this candidate's attitude to institutions? If this candidate meets resistance, will this candidate capitulate or fight to change the party? So you look at someone like Warren, who stayed out of the 2016 race and didn't endorse Sanders, didn't endorse him even immediately prior to the Massachusetts primary. Someone like that is hedging and is thinking, well, if Hillary Clinton is the nominee, I want to make sure that she doesn't dislike me. And so this is someone whose political strategy is to work with the center of the party rather than to challenge, confront, and try to change the party. And that makes me suspicious. And the fourth, is this a serious candidate? Does polling and or favorability data suggest they could really win, or are they running to promote themselves? So I think if you look at someone like Tulsi Gabbard, she doesn't have the kind of poll numbers to suggest that she can really win. And so her presence in the race takes money, resources, potentially from other candidates. And I don't see her offering anything that is distinct and different from those more competitive candidates. So I think that her principal reason for running is self-promotion.
Well, you may not agree with Benjamin on his assessment of specific candidates, but certainly I think his basic four principles are quite important, and you can find more about that in this episode on the widerviewradio.podbean.com archive, or you can go to Ben's website. Just Google Benjamin Studebaker and you will find it. Although we've had a lot of debates and ongoing campaign for the entirety of 2019, the news has been dominated by tales of Russian interference in our supposedly free and fair elections, and that all culminated recently in the impeachment of President Trump. The topic of alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election has been discussed many times on this broadcast, beginning with the appearance of former CIA Station Chief Phil Giraldi. Phil gave us an intelligence officer's viewpoint on the origins of Russiagate.
I was one of the first ones to raise the issue that John Brennan, when he was director of CIA and Obama was still on the throne, was the one who was manipulating all this stuff by virtue of going to the Brits and the Dutch and the Estonians. I suggested that might be a real possibility, that was how this started. But now it's pretty much been confirmed that exactly was a major component. And also the component in the sense that the Steele dossier was pulled together with a lot of this material and was promoted by the FBI and the CIA. So it was like, the deep state we talk about. And we talk about how the government can be manipulated from inside. Now, this is something in my time in government, we would never even have thought about that, because it was just kind of how would that work? How would you do it? But here we now have reached the point where senior government officials in the security and intelligence areas obviously colluded to manipulate a situation that they did not approve of, and indeed to bring down a president.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's a story that doesn't seem to be ready to die quite yet. I mean, the Democrats are holding on to this by dear life. They're attacking Barr now. They're beginning to attack Mueller, who they had practically elevated to sainthood earlier. And the White House now seems to be perhaps turning this investigation back on the original perpetrators. Do you think that'll come about?
Well, we're in a political sphere where it will be a political judgment on the part of someone whether it's better to pursue these issues. In other words, what we're talking about is the 2020 election already. And I think Trump, in his own sort of odd way, is making the same calculations, I think, about going after Brennan and going after some of the other perpetrators of this. A lot of whom were there are several CIA directors. Clapper was another one involved in this. And there clearly were people. There probably were, I would guess, at least scores of people involved in this who were government officials, paid government officials, working on an operation that basically was being used to discredit the electoral process and to discredit the result of an election. And these people were still not kind of clear who they were, but there were a lot of people on board for this. That's the scary part about it. It wasn't just one or two or three people who had it in for Trump for one reason or another.
Phil sees the entire Ukraine Gate issue as being something concocted by the Democrats, as Russiagate was, to try to attack Trump, rather than, of course, opposing his policies and coming up with something different that people might support. We talked about this further with Margaret Kimberly in October. Margaret is a senior editor of Black Agenda Report, which has been for many years a key source of information about the radical left in the United States and the problems of the Democratic Party in particular. Here's Margaret.
This impeachment investigation, it's interesting. It's kind of complex. On the one hand, Trump left himself open to these accusations with this, and not to put too fine a point on it, his stupid phone call with the president of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It should be investigated. Biden's conflicts of interest with his kids, his son, who apparently had no experience whatsoever, was on the board of a Ukrainian energy company being paid $50,000 a month while Biden was the point person on Ukraine. And lest we forget, the coup in Ukraine was instigated by the United States against an elected president. Viktor Yanukovych was the elected president of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Forget all the stuff about Putin's friend and whatever. The people of Ukraine elected him. And he was overthrown by right-wing forces, some of whom are open Nazi sympathizers. The United States is responsible for having done that. And then having done that, they made sure that certain people could make money, and one of whom happened to be one of Biden's kids. Mm-hmm. The idea of investigating that is valid. It should be investigated. But Trump, frankly, is not smart enough to do it. He left himself open with this phone. He knows his phone calls are recorded. I don't know what he was thinking, that he would raise this issue with the new Ukrainian president against someone who's running against him. So the conflict of interest, I don't know if it's legal or not, but it was a wrong thing to do. So he gave the Democrats a gift. Russiagate had pretty much lost its power after Robert Mueller's disastrous testimony. He didn't want to testify, lest we forget. He said, my report is my testimony, I'm not going to testify. And they forced him to do it. Ended up with egg on his face and their faces because he can't be honest about Russiagate. Russiagate is a concoction of the Democratic Party. Talk about something that ought to be investigated. The Democrats paid for the Steele dossier. The Democrats did work with some Ukrainians to try to get dirt on Paul Manafort, who, despite everything we're told about him, was involved in, this coup. It was a rolling coup. It took place over years. And Manafort and anybody lobbying or consulting in Ukraine was doing the same thing. They were trying to get Ukraine to move closer to the West, to EU membership, perhaps NATO membership. So this idea that he was doing the work of Vladimir Putin is nonsense. But the Democrats were involved there as well. So Trump, instead of breathing a sigh of relief that Russiagate, if not disproven, had lost a lot of its power, and it was the day after Mueller testified July 24th, and he makes this phone call July 25th. So it's like, he's not the sharp knife in the drawer.
Well, no one would accuse Donald Trump of being the sharpest knife in the drawer. But after listening to the testimony of State Department and intelligence agency officials and the statements of many House Democrats prior to the impeachment vote, one might get the impression that the central problem here was not the alleged quid pro quo, but the fear that Trump might actually oppose what Lieutenant Colonel Vandeman called the consensus foreign policy toward Ukraine. And herein lies the trap into which many progressives have fallen. Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone Project spoke about this recently at a forum in New York City, and here's an excerpt of his speech that we played on a previous episode.
Propaganda in the Trump era has enrolled liberals and progressives in something I think really dangerous for the world and also dangerous politically for progressive politics in general and the prospects of stopping right-wing politicians and right-wing power, where now all of a sudden intelligence officials are our heroes and Trump is to be opposed not because of anything he's doing to the general population, not because of his record tax heist the largest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history with his tax cuts, but because he's not saying mean things about Vladimir Putin. And in public, he's appearing nice to Vladimir Putin. And what does this lead to? Well, so, Trump's resistance, so-called resistance, is reduced to being led by unhinged conspiracy theorists positing that Trump is a Russian agent. All this hands Trump a massive gift, and that instead of actually opposing him, people are clinging on to these crazy theories. Another gift comes when all this finally collapses, culminating in Robert Mueller, our savior figure, delivering testimony in July and not even being familiar with the details of his own investigation, the one that was supposed to bring down Donald Trump. Now, one day later, Ukraine Gate begins, and it's pretty much a similar thing, a lot of parallels. The one difference is that this time it looks like Trump actually did something. There does appear to be some kind of scheme that he was overseeing to pressure Ukraine, although from the available evidence, I don't think it got very far, but we'll see. Maybe something will come up. But the parallels to Russiagate are enough, I think, to give pause and to be seriously concerned. Again, the source of the worry originates with the national security state. And what are they upset about? When Trump froze aid to Palestinian refugees, to UNRWA, in a deliberate bid, this was openly expressed, to basically pressure Palestinian negotiators to give up their internationally recognized right of return. So straight up blackmail. Or when Trump freezes aid to Central American migrants and in fact uses that aid to pay the salaries of the coup plotters who he's trying to install in Venezuela. These national security state officials don't say anything. But what did he do here? He froze briefly some money that was used to buy U.S. weapons to give to Ukraine to continue a proxy war that the U.S. basically started back in 2014. That's what the issue is here. And in the process, he also sought some investigations that could have implicated Joe Biden, who also happens to be another member of the elite. The main offense that Trump was supposedly committed was that he conspired in an effort to weaken another member of the elite, Hillary Clinton, which of course he didn't. But in this case, again, Trump goes after Joe Biden, and you can't do that. You can bomb Cambodia like Nixon did. You can kill and spy on activists like Nixon did. That's not impeachable, but going after another faction of the elite, that is. And so right now we're once again being enrolled in another national security state generated quote-unquote scandal with the promise again that is going to bring down Trump. And the fantasy of this being, the beginning of the end is once again very much prevalent. Underlying policy is not even scrutinized. So why are we arming Ukraine? Why are we fueling this proxy war? And why are we incentivizing Trump to increase tensions with nuclear-armed Russia? That is not being discussed. And that is one area where the dangers here are catastrophic, not just for progressive political fortunes, but for the entire world.
The consensus foreign policy does pose a threat to the entire world, as Aaron points out. We'll discuss that foreign policy in more detail next week, when my guest will be Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, author of Obama's Unending Wars, Fronting the Foreign Policy of the Permanent Warfare State. I encourage you to join us as we examine that permanent warfare state and the policies toward Russia, China, and Iran that threaten to get us into a war that could destroy all life on this planet. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.